They called Thomas Brennan a fool when he strung canvas across the rafters of his cabin in late October of 1873. His neighbors in the Montana Territory settlement of Bitterroot Valley had watched him haul in pine poles and stretch oiled duck cloth inside what should have been his winter living space, creating what looked like a tent pitched right there on his cabin floor. The other homesteaders shook their heads as they stacked their own woodpiles high, some with 6 or 7 cords split and ready for the brutal months ahead. Brennan had barely 3 cords stacked against his north wall, and now he was wasting space and effort on this ridiculous contraption. Old Willem Strasser, who'd survived 11 Montana winters, told anyone who'd listened that the newcomer wouldn't make it to Christmas. Before you decide whether Thomas Brennan was a fool or a genius, make sure you're subscribed, because this story doesn't unfold the way his neighbors expected. Margaret Hewitt, whose husband had frozen 2 winters back, said it was a shame to watch a man dig his own grave with canvas and pine. But Thomas Brennan kept working, measuring and remeasuring, cutting and stitching, creating what everyone agreed was the strangest interior any cabin in the territory had ever seen. The conventional wisdom was simple and universal across every frontier settlement from Montana to Dakota. You sealed every crack in your cabin walls with moss and clay. You built your woodpile as large as you possibly could before the first snow. You kept your fire burning day and night from November through March, feeding it constantly, because the moment those flames died down, the cold would seep through every log and board, and frostbite or worse would follow. A standard homestead cabin needed roughly 6 to 8 cords of wood to make it through a Montana winter. That was the accepted calculation, proven by years of hard experience. A single cord measured 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long when properly stacked. Most men spent their entire late summer and early autumn doing nothing but felling trees, hauling logs, and splitting wood until their hands bled and their backs screamed. It was the price of survival, and nobody questioned it. Thomas Brennan had arrived in Bitterroot Valley that spring of 1873 with his wife Sarah and their 2 young daughters, Emma and Claire. He'd been a carpenter in Pennsylvania before the war, served 3 years with the Union Army, and learned some hard lessons about staying warm in impossible conditions. He'd seen men in winter camps burn through wood faster than supply wagons could haul it, watched soldiers huddle around fires that consumed entire trees, yet left them shivering 10 feet away. He'd also spent a winter in a canvas tent during the Vicksburg campaign, and he'd noticed something that stuck with him. The men who kept their tents tighter and smaller, who created that enclosed space within the larger cold, they suffered less than those who tried to heat open areas. When he'd purchased his 160 acres under the Homestead Act and built his 16 by 20-foot cabin, he'd done the mathematics in his head. 320 cubic feet of space to heat. But what if he didn't try to heat all of it? The interior tent he constructed measured 10 feet by 12 feet, with a peaked roof that rose 7 feet at the center and sloped down to 5 feet at the sides. He'd used 8 pine poles, each carefully stripped and measured, set into brackets he'd bolted to the cabin floor. The canvas itself was heavy duck cloth, the kind used for wagon covers, treated with a mixture of linseed oil and beeswax until it was nearly waterproof and remarkably airtight. He'd double-layered it, creating a 2-inch gap between the inner and outer canvas walls. The floor of this interior tent was raised 6 inches off the cabin floor on a platform of split logs, with a thick layer of dried grass and pine needles underneath for insulation. The tent had a single entrance, a flap that could be tied shut from the inside, and a small vent hole at the peak that could be opened or closed with a drawstring. Inside this canvas structure, he placed the family's beds, a small table, and a tiny sheet iron stove that measured barely 18 inches on each side. The stove's pipe ran up through the tent's vent hole, through the cabin roof above. His neighbors watched this construction with growing bewilderment. Samuel Chon, who ran a small trading post in the settlement, asked him directly what he thought he was doing. Brennan explained his reasoning, his theory about heating smaller spaces more efficiently, about using the cabin itself as a buffer against the outside cold and the tent as the actual living space. Chun listened politely, then reminded him that Montana winters could drop to 40 below zero, that winds could howl for 3 days straight, that men had frozen to death in their own homes when their fires went out. How exactly did Brennan think a camping tent inside a cabin was going to save him when he ran out of wood in January? Brennan just smiled, and said he didn't think he'd run out. That's when the laughter really started. The science behind what Thomas Brennan had created was sound, though he couldn't have explained it in modern thermodynamic terms. What he understood intuitively was the principle of layered insulation and reduced volume. The cabin itself, with its chinked log walls and sod roof, provided the first barrier against the brutal external temperatures. The dead air space between the cabin walls and the interior tent created a buffer zone, a thermal barrier that would trap some of the heat radiating from the tent and prevent the worst of the external cold from reaching the living space. The tent itself, with its double-wall canvas construction, created another insulating layer. But the real genius was in the volume reduction. Instead of trying to heat 320 cubic feet of space, he was heating roughly 600 cubic feet inside the tent. That's barely 1/5 the volume. The amount of fuel needed to maintain comfortable temperatures in that reduced space would be dramatically less than what was required to heat the entire cabin. Additionally, the raised floor platform created yet another insulating layer, preventing the brutal cold that radiated up from frozen ground from reaching the family while they slept. October gave way to November, and the first snows arrived. Light dustings at first, then heavier falls that began to accumulate. Temperatures dropped into the 20s at night, and smoke rose from every chimney in the settlement as families began their winter fires. Thomas Brennan lit his tiny stove each evening, burning perhaps a quarter of what his neighbors fed their larger fireplaces. The small stove heated the tent's interior to comfortable levels within 30 minutes. The heat had nowhere to go, trapped by the canvas walls and ceiling, radiating down into the sleeping space. The family slept warm under wool blankets, the temperature inside the tent remaining steady even as the cabin itself grew cold. In the morning, when Brennan emerged from the tent into the main cabin to retrieve supplies or tend to the small jobs he did there, he could see his breath in the frigid air. But inside the tent, his daughters played in their underclothes, comfortable and warm. The settlement watched and whispered. Some thought he was conducting a dangerous experiment with his family's lives. Others figured he'd come to his senses when the real cold arrived. Willem Strasser made a point of counting Brennan's woodpile every time he passed, noting aloud that it didn't seem to be shrinking very fast. Must not be keeping his fire going properly, Strasser said. Gonna pay for that when the deep freeze comes. Margaret Hewitt invited Sarah Brennan to bring the girls and stay with her when Thomas came to his senses, an offer made with genuine concern and a hint of pity. But Sarah politely declined. She'd been skeptical herself at first, but after the first few weeks, she couldn't deny the evidence. They were warm, the children were healthy, and the woodpile was barely touched. December arrived with teeth bared. A storm rolled down from the north on the 5th of the month, dropping 2 feet of snow in 3 days and driving the temperatures down into single digits. The wind found every weakness in every structure, howling through cracks and gaps, making even well-built cabins feel like sieves. The settlement's residents huddled close to their fires, feeding log after log into flames that seemed to provide heat for only a few feet in any direction. The cold was a living presence, an enemy that pressed against walls and doors and windows, seeking entry. Men went through a quarter cord in those 3 days alone, their woodpiles shrinking at an alarming rate. Some began doing calculations, wondering if they'd miscalculated, if 6 cords would actually be enough. Thomas Brennan burned perhaps 30 small logs in those same 3 days. His tiny stove, barely large enough to hold pieces of wood longer than 14 inches, sipped fuel like a miser hoarding coins. The tent's interior remained comfortable, hovering around 65 degrees. The canvas walls occasionally rippled when particularly strong gusts hit the cabin outside, but that was the extent of the winter's intrusion. The cabin itself acted as a windbreak, absorbing and deflecting the worst of the storm's force. The tent never felt the wind directly. The buffer zone between cabin walls and tent meant that even though the unheated cabin interior dropped to perhaps 20 degrees, that was still 20 degrees warmer than outside. The tent only had to bridge the gap between 20 and 65, not between 10 below zero and 65. The energy savings were enormous. What Thomas had also understood, from his army experience, was the value of human body heat in a confined space. For people in a small enclosed area generate a significant amount of warmth. When his tiny stove went out during the night, the tent's temperature would drop, but not catastrophically. The four sleeping bodies maintained enough warmth that it never fell below 50 degrees inside the tent, even when no fire burned. In contrast, his neighbors in their large cabins found that when fires died overnight, temperatures could plummet to dangerous levels within hours. Many families split the night into watches, with someone always awake to tend the fire, an exhausting routine that wore people down over the course of winter. The storm broke on the 8th, leaving the landscape transformed. Snow had drifted against cabin walls, burying some structures nearly to their rooflines. The settlement dug itself out slowly, neighbors helping neighbors clear paths and doorways. When Willem Strasser finally made his way to the Brennan cabin to check on the family, expecting perhaps to find them in dire straits or worse, he found Thomas outside splitting wood with steady, unhurried strokes. The man looked rested, healthy, and his woodpile, while certainly reduced, was nowhere near as depleted as it should have been. Strasser stood there in the bitter cold, his own exhaustion evident in every line of his face, and asked outright how much wood Brennan had burned. When Thomas told him, Strasser called him a liar. Not in anger, but in disbelief. It wasn't possible. You couldn't keep a family alive in that cold on so little fuel. Thomas just shrugged and invited him inside to see for himself. What Strasser saw in that cabin changed his mind. The canvas structure was clearly visible in the dim light that filtered through the cabin's single window. He could feel the cold in the main cabin space, but when Thomas opened the tent flap, a wave of genuinely warm air spilled out. The interior glowed with the heat from the small stove, and Sarah Brennan sat inside, mending clothes while the girls played a game with carved wooden pieces. It was a scene of domestic comfort that seemed impossible given the circumstances outside. Strasser examined the construction with a critical eye, running his hand along the canvas, testing the poles, studying how the stovepipe was fitted through the ceiling. He asked questions, and Thomas answered them patiently, explaining the logic of volume reduction, of layered insulation, of using the cabin as a buffer. When Strasser left an hour later, he wasn't laughing anymore. He was thinking. The word spread through the settlement over the following days. Some folks remained skeptical, figuring there had to be a catch, some trick or hidden cost. Others began asking Thomas detailed questions about materials and construction. He answered freely, even sketching out basic plans for those who wanted to attempt their own versions. The canvas was the expensive part, he admitted. He'd brought his from Pennsylvania, but there was a mill in Fort Benton that could order it in by spring. The poles were simple enough. Any straight pine would work. The real key was getting the proportions right, creating enough space to live comfortably, but not so much that you defeated the purpose. And critically, maintaining the buffer zone between cabin and tent. That dead air space was essential. Christmas came and went, marked by a community gathering in Chin's trading post, where families shared what food they had and sang hymns to celebrate the season. The Brennan girls had rosy cheeks and bright eyes, showing no signs of the sunken-faced exhaustion that winter often brought to children by mid-season. Other families' kids were already showing the strain of long, cold months. A nasty cough had been making the rounds, probably made worse by the way people huddled close to fires, breathing smoke-heavy air. The Brennan tent, with its vent that could be adjusted to maintain fresh air circulation, seemed to have spared the family that particular misery. January arrived with a vengeance. The second week brought temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for days. -10, -15. On the 14th of January, the settlement woke to -32 degrees, cold enough that spit froze before it hit the ground. This was the kind of cold that killed people. The kind that found any weakness in clothing or shelter and exploited it ruthlessly. It was also the kind of cold that consumed wood at an appalling rate. Fires had to be fed constantly to maintain even marginal warmth. Willem Strasser went through half a cord in 5 days. Other families were burning through their supplies at similar rates, and men began looking at their diminished wood piles with genuine fear. If this winter kept hitting them with cold snaps like this, some folks weren't going to make it to spring. Not with wood to burn, anyway. The Brennan cabin sat quietly in the brutal cold, a thin trail of smoke rising from its chimney pipe. Inside the tent, the family went about their routines much as they had before. Thomas fed the small stove regularly, but each log lasted longer in the contained heat. The tent's interior stayed comfortable, hovering in the low 60s even when the cold outside was at its worst. He did make one concession during those brutal days. He hung a second canvas tarp over the tent's entrance flap, creating a small airlock space that prevented warm air from escaping every time someone needed to exit the tent to use the cabin's storage areas. This simple addition captured even more heat and reduced drafts to almost nothing. The temperature differential was staggering. When it was 32 below outside, the unheated cabin interior was perhaps 0 to 5 degrees. Cold enough that water buckets froze solid, that frost formed on the interior of the logs. But inside the tent, maintained with careful fire tending and the addition of human body heat, the temperature stayed at 62 degrees. That was a difference of nearly 100 degrees between outside and inside, achieved with a tiny stove burning perhaps 1/10 the wood that his neighbors were consuming. The physics didn't lie. Every layer of insulation, every reduction in volume heated, every bit of dead air space, it all added up to dramatic energy efficiency. By the end of January, Samuel Chun had made a decision. He approached Thomas Brennan with a proposal. Chin's own cabin was larger than Thomas's, 20 feet by 24, and he was burning through wood at an alarming rate. He had perhaps 2.5 cords left, and by his calculations, that wasn't going to be enough. Could Thomas help him construct an interior tent? Chin would pay for the labor and the materials. Thomas agreed, though he refused payment. Neighbors helped neighbors on the frontier. That was the code. Together, they constructed a canvas structure inside Chin's cabin, this one slightly larger to accommodate Chin's family of 5. It took 3 days of work, measuring and cutting and stitching and fitting. When it was complete, Chin lit his small stove for the first time in his new interior space and felt the temperature climb within the hour. His wife wept with relief. They were going to make it. February was the true test. This was the month when winter didn't just attack, it laid siege. The cold settled in and refused to leave. Day after day of below-zero temperatures, interrupted only briefly by the occasional rise into the teens that felt positively balmy by comparison. This was when wood piles disappeared, when families burned furniture and floorboards in desperation, when the unlucky or unprepared froze. The settlement had 23 families at the start of winter. By the second week of February, families had already packed up and left, unable to sustain themselves, heading south to Fort Benton or beyond, hoping to find shelter and mercy in larger towns. Those who remained drew together, sharing resources where possible, checking on each other daily. The Brennan cabin's woodpile still had nearly a full cord remaining. Thomas had been burning wood since October, and after more than 4 months, he'd consumed roughly 2 cords. 2 cords for 4 people for 4 months of Montana winter. The settlement's traditional wisdom had demanded 6 to 8 cords for the same period. The numbers were undeniable. Willem Strasser, who'd called Brennan a fool in October, now found himself down to a quarter cord with at least 6 more weeks of winter to endure. He swallowed his pride and came to Thomas's door. Could Brennan spare any wood? Could he help Strasser build a tent? Thomas looked at the old man's haggard face, saw the fear and exhaustion there, and invited him in. They'd build a tent. And yes, Thomas could spare half a cord. The buffer that Thomas had built into his calculations, the extra wood he'd kept in reserve, was meant exactly for this kind of situation. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more families in the settlement constructed interior tents with Thomas's help. Each cabin was different, requiring custom measurements and modifications to make the system work. Some had fireplaces instead of stoves, which were less efficient but could be adapted with careful design. Others had multiple rooms that needed to be considered. Thomas worked with each family to create solutions that fit their specific situations. The principle remained the same: reduce the volume being heated, create insulating layers, maintain buffer zones. Margaret Hewitt was one of the last to accept help. She'd been the most vocal critic of this foolish tent notion, but by mid-February, her situation was desperate. Her late husband's cabin was poorly chinked and drafty, and she was elderly and alone. Thomas and Samuel Chun spent 2 days on her cabin, not just building the tent, but also repairing the worst of her wall gaps and reinforcing her roof. When they finished, she had a small, warm sanctuary that would see her through to spring. The third week of February brought what would later be remembered as the worst storm of the winter. It arrived without much warning, just a change in the wind and a sudden drop in temperature. Then the snow came, driven by winds that screamed down from the mountains at speeds that made it impossible to see more than a few feet. The storm lasted 4 days. For days of whiteout conditions, of cold that penetrated everything, of wind that found every crack and gap and exploited it mercilessly. The temperature dropped to 43 below zero on the second night of the storm. Families huddled in their shelters and prayed. This was the kind of storm that killed people even in their own homes, that froze those who ran out of wood, or whose fires failed, or whose shelters proved inadequate. In the Brennan cabin, the storm's fury was muted. The wind roared outside, rattling the logs and making the whole structure creak and groan. Snow found its way through tiny gaps in the chinking, creating small drifts in the unheated cabin interior. But inside the tent, the family was safe. The tiny stove glowed red with heat, its warmth captured and held by the canvas walls. Thomas fed it regularly but not frantically, maintaining the fire at a steady level. The tent swayed slightly when particularly strong gusts hit, but the poles held firm and the canvas stayed intact. Sarah kept the girls occupied with stories and songs, teaching them letters and numbers, maintaining a sense of normalcy in the midst of chaos. The temperature inside their canvas sanctuary never dropped below 58 degrees. Willem Strasser wasn't so fortunate. The tent Thomas had helped him build was working well enough, but Strasser had waited too long to construct it. He'd burned through most of his wood maintaining his entire cabin before accepting help. Now, in the midst of the worst storm, his wood ran out. On the third day of the blizzard, he bundled himself in every piece of clothing he owned and struggled through waist-deep snow to Thomas Brennan's door. Thomas heard the pounding over the wind's howl and emerged from the tent to find the old man nearly frozen on his doorstep. He dragged Strasser inside, into the main cabin's cold interior, then into the tent's warmth. Sarah wrapped him in blankets and held hot broth to his lips while Thomas thawed the man's frost-nipped fingers and toes. When Strasser could finally speak, he said he'd come to die in company rather than freeze alone. Thomas told him he wasn't going to die. When the storm broke, they'd deal with the wood situation. Until then, Strasser would stay here, and he'd survive. The storm finally exhausted itself on the fourth day, the winds dying gradually until the world fell into an eerie silence. The snow stopped falling, and the sky cleared to reveal a cold so profound it made the air itself seem brittle. But the sun shone, and men emerged from their cabins to assess damage and check on neighbors. The settlement had survived, but barely. 2 cabins had partially collapsed under snow loads. One family had suffered severe frostbite when their fire went out overnight. But no one had died. That in itself was a minor miracle. The community gathered at Chin's trading post once paths were cleared, and the conversation centered on one topic: how to prevent this from happening again. How to make it through the rest of this winter and prepare properly for the next. Thomas Brennan found himself in the unfamiliar position of being the settlement's expert on winter survival. Men who'd lived through a dozen Montana winters were asking his advice, seeking his opinion, requesting his help. He shared everything he knew, holding nothing back. The tent system wasn't complicated, but it did require attention to detail and proper construction. He helped families calculate their wood needs for the remainder of winter, showed them how to make their small stoves more efficient, taught them about air circulation and moisture control. The most important lesson, he stressed, was planning ahead. This winter had caught many people unprepared. Next winter, they'd know better. March arrived like a gift, bringing temperatures that rose into the 20s and 30s. The worst was over, though winter still had weeks to run. But the deadly cold snaps were done, and people could begin to think about spring, about planting and building and recovery. The Brennan cabin's woodpile still had wood in it, enough to see the family through to April if needed. Thomas had burned perhaps 2.5 cords total for the entire winter. His neighbors, those who'd managed to make it through, had consumed 6, 8, even 10 cords. The difference was irrefutable. By the time the snow began to melt in earnest, 15 of the settlement's remaining families had constructed some version of an interior tent system. Each was slightly different, adapted to specific needs and circumstances, but all followed the same basic principles. The reduction in wood consumption across the settlement was dramatic. Samuel Chin calculated that those families using tents had burned roughly 60% less wood than traditional methods would have required. In a frontier environment where wood meant survival, where every cord required dozens of hours of brutal labor to produce. That efficiency represented not just comfort, but life itself. News of the tent system spread beyond Bitterroot Valley. Travelers and traders carried stories of the strange interior structures that had saved the settlement during the brutal winter of 1873 to 1874. Other communities began experimenting with the concept. A rancher near Fort Benton constructed a tent in his bunkhouse that kept his hired men warm while using a fraction of their normal wood. A missionary family in the Dakota Territory adapted the design for their station, creating multiple small tent rooms within their large building. A mining camp in the Rockies built communal tent structures inside a large timber hall, housing 30 men through winter on a wood budget that previously would have sustained only 10. Thomas Brennan became something of a local legend, though he shrugged off the attention. He was just a man who'd paid attention during his Army days, who'd thought through a problem logically and applied what he knew. He hadn't invented anything new. Insulation and volume reduction were basic concepts. He'd just applied them in a way that made sense for frontier cabin life. But the settlement disagreed. What he'd done was save lives. Willem Strasser, who'd recovered from his close call during the February storm, made a point of publicly acknowledging that he'd have frozen to death if not for Brennan's help and knowledge. Margaret Hewitt said the same. Others echoed their gratitude. The following summer, Thomas helped build 3 new cabins for families arriving in the settlement, and each was designed with the tent system in mind from the start. Slightly smaller than traditional cabins, with more attention to chinking and sealing, these structures were purpose-built to work with interior tents. The new families would never have to learn the hard lesson that so many others had learned the previous winter. They'd have the advantage of accumulated knowledge, of proven methods, of a community that understood how to survive in this harsh land. In the autumn of 1874, as Thomas Brennan split wood for his second Montana winter, he had a visitor. A man from the territorial newspaper in Helena had ridden out specifically to interview him about his tent system. Thomas was reluctant, but Sarah convinced him to cooperate. The article that appeared in the Helena Weekly Herald that October described the system in detail, complete with measurements and construction advice. It was reprinted in newspapers across Montana Territory and beyond. Letters arrived at the Brennan cabin from as far away as Minnesota and Wyoming, from people requesting more information, offering thanks, reporting their own successes with the design. The winter of 1874 to 1875 was mild by Montana standards, which some folks said was a shame because it didn't give the tent system a proper second test. But Thomas knew better. A mild winter meant less suffering, fewer deaths, more families surviving to see spring. That was success regardless of how well any particular technique was proven. And when winter did bare its teeth during a cold snap in January, the settlement's families weathered it comfortably, their canvas sanctuaries keeping them warm and safe. The method Thomas Brennan had pioneered that autumn day when his neighbors called him a fool spread across the American frontier over the following decades. It was adapted and modified, improved and customized, but the core principle remained. In harsh winters where wood was scarce and cold was deadly, the interior tent system saved countless lives. Exactly how many will never be known. But in places where winter meant a fight for survival, where the difference between enough wood and not enough could mean the difference between life and death, Brennan's simple canvas structures made that fight easier to win. The Brennan family stayed in Bitterroot Valley, raising their daughters and eventually grandchildren on that same 160 acres. Thomas lived to be 73, dying peacefully in 1907 in a house that had replaced the original cabin. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his service in the Civil War and his contributions to the settlement's founding. But old-timers in the community remembered him for something more specific. They remembered the winter when a newcomer had pitched a tent inside his cabin and proved that sometimes the most foolish-looking idea turned out to be the wisest course. They remembered how he'd helped families survive when survival seemed impossible. They remembered the lessons he'd taught about preparation and adaptation and thinking beyond conventional wisdom. Willem Strasser, who outlived Thomas by 3 years, told the story often in his final decade. How he'd called Brennan a fool. How he'd laughed at the tent. How he'd nearly frozen to death because of his own stubborn adherence to the old ways. And how Brennan had saved his life, not just with wood but with knowledge and generosity. Strasser always ended the story the same way. The smartest man in the settlement, he'd say, was the one everyone thought was crazy. That's a lesson worth remembering. In the hardscrabble communities of the Montana Territory, in the Wyoming settlements and Dakota homesteads, in the Colorado mining camps and Idaho logging towns, the story of Thomas Brennan and his interior tent became part of frontier lore. It was passed down through families, taught to newcomers, adapted to changing times and technologies. When modern heating systems eventually made the technique obsolete, the story remained as a reminder of frontier ingenuity, of the kind of creative problem-solving that survival demanded in those harsh places and times. They stopped laughing that winter of 1873. They stopped laughing when the February storm hit and the tent dwellers stayed warm while others froze. They stopped laughing when the mathematics of wood consumption became undeniable. They stopped laughing when Willem Strasser nearly died and Thomas Brennan saved him. And they never forgot what Thomas had taught them about survival, about efficiency, about the courage it takes to try something different when everyone else tells you you're wrong. In a land where winter was the greatest enemy and wood was the currency of life, he'd shown them a better way. That was his legacy, written not in newspapers or monuments, but in the lives saved and the families that survived because one man had looked at an old problem and seen a new solution.